The thunder rolled like distant cannon fire across the Bitterroot Range, shaking the valley floor and rattling loose flakes of bark from the tall pines. Rain fell in heavy sheets, driven sideways by mountain wind that tore branches from trees and flung them against rocks with the force of flying axes. Somewhere between the peaks of what would one day be called western Montana, the worst storm in decades battered every structure it could find, except one. The cabin stood alone on a rocky rise just above a swollen creek, its roof unbowed, its walls unbreached, smoke curling steadily from the stone chimney, as if the chaos outside were no more than a passing spring drizzle. Inside, Nathaniel Boone sat by the fire, the warmth radiating from thick masonry that glowed with stored heat. He barely glanced at the storm. He'd been through worse, and built for worse. The cabin didn't shake, the windows didn't rattle, the door didn't even creak on its hinges. It was, to all appearances, a fortress wrapped in pine and stone. Other mountain men had seen it. Some had even stayed the night, and they all said the same thing. It wasn't a cabin. It was something else, something they didn't quite understand, something they wouldn't try themselves, even if they were impressed. Because there were rules in the mountains, unspoken codes passed from one trapper to the next, and one of the oldest, most quietly accepted was this: don't tempt the land by pretending you can beat it. Nathaniel Boone had broken that rule, but he hadn't done it for pride or show. He'd done it because one storm had taken everything from him, and after that, he swore no storm would ever take anything again. The year was 1839. The fur trade was already waning, and mountain men were adapting. Some turned guide, some turned outlaw, some settled, finding wives among the Shoshone or Crow, and building small homesteads on the edges of what would one day be claimed by surveyors and maps. Nathaniel had spent 9 years in the high country by that point, trapping, hunting, occasionally serving as scout for expeditions pushing westward. He was not famous like some, not feared, but among the older trappers his name carried weight. He was cautious, skilled, and quiet. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't talk much, and never went into the wilderness unprepared. That spring, he'd been living in a simple log cabin along the eastern fork of the Salmon River. It was a good spot, elevated with fresh water nearby, and game trails crossing close enough that even a lazy trapper could pull in steady meat. He'd built the cabin himself 3 years earlier, using the same methods every mountain man used: notched logs, chinking made of moss and clay, a crude stone hearth, no foundation to speak of, no overhangs, no drainage ditches, just 4 walls, a roof, and a place to hang your rifle at night. It wasn't perfect, but it had held until it didn't. The storm hit in early May, sudden and violent, a collision of spring warmth and lingering winter cold. Thunder shook the ground so hard that trees split where they stood. Wind screamed through the valley, stripping bark and toppling lodge poles like matchsticks. The creek swelled to triple its size in a matter of hours, bursting over its banks and scouring the soil from beneath the cabin's back corner. Nathaniel was inside when the first wall buckled. He barely made it out before the structure collapsed, logs crashing into the water, his rifle lost, his pack gone, his supplies scattered downstream like dead leaves. When the rain stopped 2 days later, Nathaniel came back. He stood on the muddy bank and stared at what had been his home. Not anger, not grief, just realization. The cabin hadn't been built wrong. It had been built normally, and normal hadn't been enough. Not out here, not against storms like that. He didn't salvage anything. He didn't look for his rifle. He didn't try to rebuild in the same spot. Instead, he shouldered the one thing he'd managed to keep, his belt knife, and walked away, heading west without a clear destination, just walking, thinking, watching the sky. It was during that long walk that the idea began to form. It didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, a moment watching wind strip branches from a pine and leave the ones behind the boulder untouched. A night sleeping under an overhang, dry despite the sleet. A conversation with an old Nez Perce woman who spoke of how their winter lodges sat partially beneath the earth, hidden from the wind entirely. Nathaniel wasn't a trained engineer, but he understood patterns, understood nature, understood survival, and over the course of that spring and summer, he began collecting the pieces of a new kind of construction. He called it the low design. Others called it worse: burrow building, digging like a marmot, tunneler's folly. No one wanted to copy it, but after seeing what it could endure, more than one man quietly asked to stay the night. Nathaniel chose his site with more care than most men picked a wife. High ground, but not too high. A southern exposure for light, a stone outcropping behind it to shield the wind and absorb heat. The creek no closer than 200 yards, but within line of sight. He dug first, not for a foundation, but for space. 3 feet down, wide enough for a floor plan twice the usual size. He left stone ridges in the trench, notched like steps, which would hold the weight of the logs above. He used those ridges to create thermal sinks, places where rock would absorb the sun's heat and radiate it back during the night. The walls weren't stacked above the earth. They were anchored inside it. He didn't use saddle notches or dovetails. He carved mortise and tenon joints, hammering each connection with pegs of ironwood soaked in linseed oil, then wrapped each joint in oilskin before fitting them into place. It was slower, much slower, but the result was joints that flexed with temperature shifts and stayed dry even in sleet. The logs were different too. Cedar, not pine. Cedar swelled when wet but resisted rot, insects, and splitting. He cut the trees in fall, dragged them with a mule he traded 2 traps for, and debarked every inch by hand. Then he burned them lightly, just enough to harden the surface and close the pores, a method he'd seen used in Japanese shipbuilding, though he'd never heard of Japan. Just a trick an old sailor once showed him. The result was a kind of armor, fire-hardened wood that didn't soak up water, didn't warp, and held its shape even when wind slammed into it like a battering ram. And then there was the roof. Most cabins had roofs you could punch through with your fist if you hit the right spot. Not Nathaniel's. His roof started with stone, flat river rocks laid over oak beams so thick it took 2 men to lift one. Over the stone he placed bark, layered like shingles, then moss, then more stone, smaller this time for weight, and finally a canvas tarp coated in pine pitch and rolled tight beneath a final layer of lichen and earth. The entire structure sloped not in one direction but in 3, channeling water away through hidden runnels cut into the outer logs. He'd turned his roof into a natural watershed, capable of withstanding inches of rain without leaking a drop. And then there were the braces. Inside the walls, unseen unless you were present during construction, Nathaniel had embedded crossbeams and tension rods, fashioned from salvaged wagon iron, into the very bones of the cabin. The whole structure could sway slightly under pressure, flexing with the wind like a tree rather than resisting it like a barn. Most men thought rigidity was strength. Nathaniel had learned otherwise. A storm could snap a rigid post in 2, but a supple beam could bend and live. When it was done, it didn't look like much. Half buried, windowless on 2 sides, the stone chimney rising like a stub from the center instead of the edge. No porch, no trail leading up, just a door reinforced with 2 layers of hide stretched over oak, riveted with iron pins and sealed with a compression latch that had to be levered open with a bar. To outsiders it looked paranoid, strange, wrong, but when the storms came it held. Not once did a log shift, not once did a draft whistle through the seams. Inside it stayed warm, dry, still, and that was when the rumors started. Some said he'd found plans in an old Spanish mission. Others claimed he'd gone mad after his cabin washed away and started listening to voices in the wind. A few whispered darker things, that he'd made a pact with something in the forest, and the cabin was part of that bargain. Nathaniel never corrected them. Let them talk. He didn't care if they called it cursed. He only cared that it stood, but not everyone left it alone. And when a group of desperate men tried to take it, by force, thinking whatever secrets lay inside were worth stealing, they discovered just how untouchable that cabin really was. They came just after dusk, 5 figures on horseback, dark against the fading light, their outlines flickering in the pale orange wash of the setting sun. Nathaniel saw them before they saw him. He was perched in the timberline just west of the cabin, watching the storm fronts building over the peaks. The sky had that look again, low-hanging clouds streaked with bruise-colored veins, and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone riding the wind like a warning. But the men drew his eye first. He watched as they crossed the clearing below, cutting diagonally through the grass, making no attempt to conceal their movement. That alone told him something. They weren't here for trade. They weren't lost, and they weren't friendly. He slipped back through the trees, quiet as a cougar, descending the shallow slope behind his chimney. By the time he reached the back corner of the cabin, barely visible under the thick roof overhang, he could already hear the hoofbeats slowing, murmurs, a laugh, the creak of leather. He didn't light a lamp, didn't draw a weapon, just waited in the shadows as the first man dismounted. They approached like they owned the place. One of them knocked, more as a gesture than anything else, the dull thump of knuckles on the reinforced door sounding like a child tapping a boulder. No answer. Another man chuckled. "Ain't nobody here." He tried the latch. It didn't budge. Locked. Tight. Nathaniel stepped forward then, just enough to be heard, not seen. "You're not welcome here." The men froze. One spun. 2 reached instinctively for pistols, but the voice had come from behind them, low and even. unhurried. One of them, the tallest, called out, trying to sound amused. "Well now, friend, we're just looking for shelter. Weather's coming in fast. Thought maybe you'd let us warm by the fire, share a meal." Nathaniel didn't respond immediately. He knew the type. They were too smooth, too confident. They'd seen the cabin from the ridgeline above the valley trail, heard the stories, maybe even believed the rumors, and now they were here, expecting to take what they wanted, 5 against 1, or so they thought. "You can build your own fire," Nathaniel said. "Plenty of wood, plenty of rocks. This one's already spoken for." The men didn't like that. He could hear it in the shift of their weight, the scrape of boots in gravel. The same tall one answered, voice colder now. "See, that's the thing. We ain't asking. We're staying, one way or another." Then came the sound Nathaniel had expected all along, the soft click of a hammer being drawn back. He vanished into the shadows again before the gun could be raised. The first shot hit the door, sending a dull thud through the thick hide and oak layers, splinters flying like dust. But it didn't open. Didn't even crack. One of the men rushed it, shoulder lowered, expecting the force to burst through as it might with any normal trapper's cabin. He bounced off with a grunt, clutching his arm. "What the hell is this thing?" No answer came, only the first flash of lightning splitting the sky above, followed by a clap of thunder that rolled across the mountains like cannon fire. The storm was nearly overhead now. The 5 men circled the cabin, testing windows, trying to pry at the eaves, looking for weakness. They found none. The overhangs protected every joint. The walls had no exterior chinking to pick at. The windows were inset behind storm shutters reinforced with crossbeams from within. It was like trying to break into a tree trunk buried in stone. And Nathaniel was gone, or so they thought. He was inside, had slipped through the back crawl space where a narrow tunnel, hidden beneath a deadfall and masked with brush, led to the foundation. He hadn't used it in months, had never needed to, but it was there for this exact moment. Because if the storms ever came with men behind them, the cabin needed to defend more than just against wind and rain. Inside, he moved silently, unlatching the long brace he kept tucked beneath the rafters. It wasn't a rifle, it wasn't even a pistol. It was a handmade staff, ironwood wrapped in rawhide, embedded with stone flakes along the shaft. A weapon designed not for shooting, but for survival, for defense, for breaking kneecaps and wrists. He moved to the trapdoor in the floor and waited, listening. Outside, the rain began. It didn't come gently. It slammed the earth like a thrown pail, immediate and drenching, the kind that turns solid ground into muck in minutes. The men cursed, scrambling for cover. 2 made for the small lean-to near the tree line. Another pounded again on the door, his voice ragged. "Open up, damn it!" Nathaniel didn't. He knew the storm would do half the work for him. The winds came next, howling down through the pass, lifting sheets of water into the air, flinging grit and leaves sideways like shrapnel. One of the horses spooked and bolted, kicking a man in the thigh as it went. Another cursed, chasing after it and slipping in the mud. That's when Nathaniel opened the trapdoor. He emerged behind the cabin, crouched low, slipping through the rising mist like a ghost. He moved to the lean-to first. 2 men inside, huddled against the logs, backs to him. He struck the first in the knee, dropping him with a scream. The second turned just in time to catch the staff in the ribs. Both were down before they knew what hit them. He didn't stay, didn't linger. Moved next to the tree where another had taken shelter. This one saw him, fired, missed. Nathaniel lunged, driving the end of the staff into the man's gut, then sweeping low to knock him flat. 3 down. The last 2 were near the cabin, pounding on the door again. Nathaniel let them finish, waited until the next flash of lightning blinded the sky, then struck. This time they fought back. One drew a blade, slashing wildly. The other had a pistol, already soaked and misfiring. It didn't matter. Nathaniel wasn't fighting to kill. He was fighting to remove, to end the threat. When it was done, all 5 lay in the mud, groaning, stunned, broken in places but alive. Nathaniel stood over them, soaked to the bone, his breath ragged. "You wanted shelter," he said quietly. "There's your shelter. Dirt, water, and wind." He turned and went back inside, sealed the trapdoor, lit the fire. By morning, the storm had passed. The men were gone when he emerged, left without a word. One had carved something into a tree near the lean-to, just a phrase, "Don't touch the earth house." Word spread fast. Men talked, as they always did, and the story twisted, as stories do. Some said Nathaniel had gone feral. Others claimed the cabin was cursed, that those who tried to enter without welcome vanished. A few whispered that the mountain itself protected him, that he'd struck some ancient bargain, but none returned, and none dared build like him, not until the storm of 44, when 5 cabins were flattened in one night, and a young trapper named Caleb tracked down the reclusive man who'd once beaten a tempest and 5 armed men without firing a shot. Nathaniel didn't open the door at first, but Caleb was patient, and the storm that followed would test every lesson the old man had learned. The boy stood there for 3 days. His name was Caleb Harker, and he'd come up from the southern valleys with 2 mules, a broken hat, and the kind of eyes that told you he'd already seen more than he should have at 20. When he reached Nathaniel Boone's cabin, he didn't knock, didn't call out, just unpacked a wool blanket, set a small camp just beyond the stone boundary Nathaniel had built years before, and waited. The cabin didn't acknowledge him. No smoke from the chimney, no figure at the window, no sound. It could have been abandoned for all the world knew, sunken into the slope like a forgotten boulder. But Caleb wasn't stupid. He knew what he was doing. You didn't rush a man like Boone. You waited until the mountain told him you were worth listening to. The first night, wind screamed through the trees, loud enough to bend the tall firs like bows. Caleb tied his mule to a root and crouched beneath a canvas pulled taut between 2 stakes. Rain soaked him through before midnight. He didn't move. The second night was worse. Lightning tore the ridge in half, and the air crackled so loud it sounded like God was snapping bones. Still, he stayed, didn't even light a fire. The third night came with silence, deafening, absolute silence, the kind that makes you feel small in the dark. Coyotes wouldn't howl, birds wouldn't call. The sky pressed in with a dull weight. Caleb chewed on a piece of dried venison and watched the tree line, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. And finally, just before dawn, the door creaked open. Nathaniel Boone stepped out slowly, wrapped in a worn buffalo hide, hair silvered like frost, eyes dark as the storm drainages that scarred the Bitterroot valleys. He didn't speak at first, just looked, studied the boy like a tracker studies signs in the dirt. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't stand, just met his gaze and nodded once. "You know how to wait," Nathaniel said, his voice more gravel than wind. "I know how to freeze," Caleb replied, a grunt, not quite a laugh, but not disapproval either. Nathaniel motioned once with his hand. "Bring your mule, leave your pride," Caleb followed. Inside, the cabin was warmer than he'd imagined, not just in temperature, but in feel. The logs, darkened with age and fire smoke, radiated comfort. The stone fireplace glowed gently, though no flame was visible, just the lingering heat from a midday burn. The air smelled of pine resin and something older, something earthbound. The walls were layered but not cluttered, tools hung with care. The floor was dry, the beams overhead thick enough to carry the weight of another storm season. Nathaniel handed him a tin cup filled with tea. Not coffee, no sugar, just heat and something bitter. "You're here for what you think I know," Nathaniel said. Caleb nodded. "My brother's dead. Cabin fell in on him. Snow load crushed the ridge beam. He was asleep, never woke up." Nathaniel sat without responding. "I built it," Caleb continued, "same as I was taught. Notched corners, split log ridgepole, pine chinking, just like everybody else. Thought I did it right." Nathaniel stared into the hearth, eyes catching the glow of coals like embers in iron. "That's the problem," he said. "You did it right." A long pause followed. "I've heard the stories," Caleb said quietly, "about this place, about you, that you made a cabin the land couldn't touch." Nathaniel's jaw tensed. "There's no such thing." "Then teach me to build the next closest thing." Silence again. Then Nathaniel stood and walked to a low chest beneath the east window. He opened it slowly and pulled out a roll of parchment bound in hide, unfurled it on the table. Caleb stepped forward. It wasn't a drawing, not really, no measurements, no compass lines, just diagrams, rough, sketched with charcoal and dirt, cross-sections of wall structures, notes about airflow, symbols for drainage, pressure, leverage, more like the instructions a wolf would write if it had hands and wanted to teach you how to survive winter. Nathaniel tapped one section. "You don't build to defy the storm, you build to absorb it." Caleb studied the markings. "I don't understand." "You will, if you stay through the snow." That was the beginning. Nathaniel didn't teach like a teacher. He taught like a fire teaches, slowly, painfully, through contact and consequence. He didn't explain the why, not at first, just gave Caleb tasks. Haul stone, cut cedar, sharpen tools, strip bark, burn the ends of logs just enough to make them hiss. By the second week, Caleb's hands were raw. His shoulders ached so deeply he couldn't lift them in the morning. His breath steamed like smoke, even inside the cabin. But he kept at it, every day, every hour, because something in Nathaniel's voice told him this wasn't just instruction. It was a kind of penance, and Caleb felt the same weight in his own bones. By the end of the first month, they began assembling the foundation of a new structure, half dug into the hill, facing southeast, where the wind came softest. The first lesson was simple. Don't build on the earth, build with it. Use the slope, carve drainage trenches beneath the frost line, lay basalt plates in a curved pattern to distribute weight. They built a subfloor not from wood, but packed earth mixed with lime and pine ash, a technique Nathaniel called cold-fighting clay. It held heat like a hearthstone and never turned to sludge when wet. The second lesson was airflow. Most men build cabins like coffins, Nathaniel said, tight in the wrong ways, loose in worse. Air moves whether you like it or not. You can fight it or you can use it. They cut high vents into the north and south walls, adjustable flaps that could be plugged in winter and opened in summer. Each wall had a narrow shaft carved at a slight inward angle, allowing hot air to rise and exit while drawing cooler air in low from the eastern crawl. The chimney was triple-skinned, stone, then clay, then an outer wrap of bark and ash cement. It breathed like a lung, regulating draft even in a downpour. Then came the walls. Notched joints were banned. Nathaniel taught Caleb to carve dovetail sockets, reinforced with pitch, and hammered in with wooden nails soaked in elk tallow. Each log was shaped flat on top and bottom, fire-treated, and seated with a layer of wool felt made from shaved bison hide, smoked and oiled to resist rot. You seal the air but not the cabin, Nathaniel said. Let the structure move, let the pressure flow. The roof took longer. They didn't just lay beams, they wove them, alternating timber and branch, then layering stone slabs, bark sheeting, moss insulation, and finally a layer of living sod seeded with prairie grass. It weighed nearly 2 tons, and Nathaniel claimed it could stop hail like a shield. Why sod? Caleb had asked. Because it grows back, Nathaniel said. When the sky tears it up, it heals itself, like skin. That fall, as the first snow fell, they moved into the new structure. It wasn't finished, not really. A cabin like that never was. But it held. The temperature dropped below zero more than once that winter. Winds hit 40 miles an hour. At one point, the drifts reached shoulder height, and several lesser cabins nearby were crushed by the sheer weight of snowpack. But Caleb and Nathaniel sat in their cabin and sipped tea, the warmth steady, the floor dry, the walls unmoving. They spoke little, but by February, something shifted. Caleb began sketching his own diagrams, testing his own ideas, and Nathaniel watched with quiet approval. Not pride, not quite, but something close, until the letter arrived. It came on muleback, tied with twine, soaked from rain but legible. It was from a small settlement 2 valleys east, a town with no name, just a smattering of cabins and a trading post. Their schoolhouse had collapsed, 2 children killed. They were calling for help, not money, not medicine, blueprints. Someone had told them about the boy and the old man who built a cabin the storms couldn't touch, and they wanted to know if it was true. Nathaniel stood by the fire, holding the letter in calloused hands. Caleb looked up from his sketches. Should we go? He asked. Nathaniel didn't answer right away, because the moment he taught others, the moment he passed on the method fully, it would no longer be hidden. And storms aren't the only things that don't like being challenged. They left the cabin at dawn, boots crunching across frost-hardened pine needles, packs slung low and heavy with tools, parchment, and weeks' worth of dried meat. Nathaniel walked ahead, his stride measured, silent as ever. Caleb followed, his mind swirling with questions he didn't dare speak yet. The boy was no longer soft. A winter spent beside the old man had carved something sharp into his bones. Discipline, resilience, maybe even a touch of that same wordless fire that seemed to smolder behind Boone's every movement. They traveled east, cutting across timbered ridgelines and frozen creeks, passing through silent meadows where snowdrifts still lingered like ghosts. The land was quiet this time of year, between thaw and bloom, when the animals were scarce and the wind did most of the talking. They made camp each night beneath the same rule Nathaniel always followed. No flame without cover, no words after dusk. The mountains watched everything. Better to move like shadows than light a beacon for the wrong eyes. It took 4 days to reach the settlement. Hollow Creek, someone had started calling it, though there was no official name and no one to write it down. Just a scattered crescent of cabins nestled at the edge of a shallow valley, with a trading post, a church shack, and what had once been a 1-room schoolhouse. The roof had collapsed weeks earlier, taking the lives of 2 children and fracturing the jaw of a 3rd. The storm had been brutal. Wet snow, sleet, high winds, but not the worst the mountains had ever thrown. What killed those children wasn't the weather. It was poor design. Rushed beams, under-supported trusses, green timber cut too late in the year and nailed in place by men who didn't know what they didn't know. The people of Hollow Creek had written the letter in desperation, not certainty. The man who carried it west was a trapper named Morris Tate, the closest thing the town had to a leader. He met them at the edge of the settlement, eyes hollow with sleepless guilt. "We didn't think anyone would come," he said, offering his hand. Nathaniel didn't shake it, just nodded. "Where's the damage? Tate led them to the collapsed shell of the schoolhouse. Snow still crusted the edges, though the central pile had melted down into a mush of sodden planks and broken rafters. A child's mitten lay half buried in the slush. Caleb knelt beside it, saying nothing. Nathaniel walked the perimeter, measured it in strides, squinted at the angle of collapse, dug a knuckle into the charred remains of the central post. It crumbled like ash. "They use lodgepole pine," he muttered. "Cut it green. You can see the sap tracks." Tate grimaced. "It's what we had." "You had rocks," Nathaniel said, pointing to the granite ridge behind the town. "You had clay. You had sod. You had the same things the land gives everyone. You just didn't know how to listen." The man flushed, bristling. "We're farmers and carpenters, not hermits or mystics. You want to help or not?" Nathaniel stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Caleb. "Set camp. We'll need 3 days." They built a temporary lean-to near the edge of the settlement. Caleb began unpacking diagrams, tools, and sample materials, while Nathaniel gathered the adults. He laid out no blueprints, no measurements. Instead, he scratched in the dirt with a charred stick, explaining principles as if he were reciting scripture. "Weight isn't your enemy. It's your anchor. Cold doesn't seep through stone. It rests in it. You want to keep heat? You bury it. You want to stop collapse? You spread the load like a spiderweb, not a plank across 2 beams." Some of the men scoffed. A few nodded, confused but intrigued. It was the women who asked the sharper questions. "How do we insulate if we can't cut enough logs? What about airflow in summer? Where does the water drain if the ground's still frozen?" Nathaniel answered each without pause, not with arrogance but precision. Caleb watched the crowd shift, minds turning, curiosity replacing pride. That night, after the fire was banked, and the valley hushed beneath stars, Caleb leaned close. "Why do they call it the forbidden method?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He stared up at the stars, a long breath hanging in the cold air. "Because it works too well," he said finally. "Because it makes men believe they've beaten the mountain." "And have we?" "No," Nathaniel said softly. "We've just learned how to kneel in the right places." The next morning, they began. Caleb directed the clearing, while Nathaniel supervised foundation work. No standard trenches. Instead, they taught the settlers to dig steps into the slope, filling each level with crushed rock and tamped earth to create tiered pads of pressure distribution. Every corner was marked with iron stakes, salvaged from old wagons, bent and hammered to function as rebar. The floor wouldn't be wood. It would be a floating slab of earthen clay mixed with ash, packed atop dried moss and bark insulation. By day 3, the town was buzzing. Half the able-bodied men worked on the new structure, while the other half began examining their own homes with fresh eyes. Nathaniel moved between groups like a conductor, explaining pitch angles, vent placement, and support overlap. Caleb translated when needed, putting the old man's blunt terms into actionable steps. But not everyone was on board. A carpenter named Amos Laird, loud, red-faced, and convinced of his own wisdom, confronted them on the 4th morning. He strode into the build site, waving a square and level, shouting for attention. "This is madness," he barked. "There's no order, no proper scale, no symmetry. You're building a burrow, not a school." Nathaniel didn't look up from the clay wall he was tamping. "Children don't die in burrows." Amos turned redder. "You're setting a dangerous example. These people need stability, not superstition. You think the land won't fight back if we start defying it. This is how accidents happen." "The last accident," Nathaniel said, finally facing him, "came from doing it your way." Amos stalked off, but not before enough eyes turned to make his words shrivel in the air. Despite the friction, progress surged. By the end of the first week, the walls were up, thicker on the windward side, double layered with an air gap stuffed with straw and ash clay mix. The chimney rose at the center, not the edge, and flared at the base to radiate heat across the whole interior. The roof was a mosaic of flat stone and sod, layered atop split beams woven with bark and sealed with pitch. It looked nothing like a traditional structure. It looked alive. On the 10th day, they lit the hearth. The fire caught clean and slow, smoke curling up the flue like breath into sky. Children stood wide-eyed as the walls held the warmth, even with the door open. Mothers stepped inside and felt no draft, no cold spots. The clay floor radiated heat upward. The ceiling traps recirculated air. Every surface worked together like organs in a living body. For the first time since the collapse, Hollow Creek knew warmth that wasn't borrowed from fatigue or firewood, but something else came with it. Snow began falling on the 12th night. Not heavy, not loud, just a steady, relentless drift. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the new schoolhouse and watched it gather on the sod roof, unmoving, unfazed. Caleb stood beside him. "We beat it," the boy whispered. Nathaniel didn't smile. "No," he said. "It's testing us." The snow didn't stop. 2 feet in 48 hours. Then ice, then wind. The cabin held, the school held. But some of the older homes, built years ago, without thought of slope or support, began to groan, and then one collapsed. Not a full cave-in, just a partial wall failure on a cabin near the creek. A family of 5 stumbled out, soaked, clutching blankets. The storm howled. Caleb looked to Nathaniel. "We need to do more." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "Then it's time to show them everything," because the method didn't stop at one building. It could reshape the whole town if they were willing to pay the price for knowledge that wasn't meant to be widespread. The collapse changed everything. Until then, Nathaniel had held the reins tight, feeding the town his method piece by piece, always on his terms. But once the Hodges family clawed their way out of the crushed east wall of their home, soaked, shivering, the youngest boy bleeding from a splinter wound in his neck, something shifted in the soul of Hollow Creek. The people no longer looked to Boone as a curiosity or a reluctant guide. They looked to him like a lifeline, and the pressure mounted. Within hours, 3 more families began evacuating their homes. Walls groaned, rafters bowed under the wet weight of ice-caked snow. The air held that strange, muffled heaviness storms leave behind, the stillness before the second wave. Nathaniel knew what it meant. This wasn't the main event. This was the throat-clearing before the scream. They came to him at dusk, lanterns flickering, boots crunching in the fresh crust, a quiet desperation on every face. Morris Tate led them. Beside him stood 2 widows, one of the injured children, and Amos Laird, the carpenter who'd argued so loudly just days earlier. He wasn't shouting now. His voice had the dry tone of a man whose world was falling in on itself. "We need to rebuild," he said. "Not just the schoolhouse, all of it." Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He stood in the shadow of the new school's eastern wall, fingers grazing the packed sod like he was feeling for a heartbeat. Caleb was by his side, watching him closely. "This wasn't meant to be taught wide," Nathaniel said at last, voice low. Morris stepped forward. "Then what was it meant for?" Nathaniel looked at him, not with anger, with weariness. "Survival, for the few who'd lost enough to learn from it." Caleb finally spoke, voice steadier than he felt. "But what if we don't survive without it?" Nathaniel turned toward the cabin, pushed open the heavy door, and motioned for them to follow. Inside, he unrolled the same hidebound parchment he'd shown Caleb that first day. But this time, he opened a second scroll, one even Caleb hadn't seen. It was older, more fragile. The drawings were more elaborate, cutaways of roofs with precise drainage paths, pressure dispersion models scrawled in angular marks, notations in a strange shorthand that mixed phonetic French, Old Dutch, and something else, something even Nathaniel seemed hesitant to explain. "This wasn't mine originally," he said, eyes on the page. "It belonged to a man who taught me." He called it the Trapper's Covenant, not because it was sacred, but because you had to agree to suffer first before it made sense. Caleb stared at the pages. "Why keep it hidden?" "Because once people understand it," Nathaniel said, "they think they're safe. But the mountain always changes. The method doesn't stop the world from breaking. It just buys you time." The next day, they began what would become known, years later, as the Hollow Creek Overbuild. Nathaniel and Caleb worked in shifts, directing 3 build crews at once. The town was divided into zones, core structures, like the school and supply house, residential cabins most at risk of collapse, and outbuildings like smokehouses and stables. Everything had to be triaged, rebuilt, reinforced. They used what the land offered: crushed riverstone for mass, pine ash and moss for insulation, sod and bark for outer skin. Every log was stripped, burned, and hand-shaped. Every corner joint was bound not with nails or iron, but with tension-sleeved wedges that allowed for minor shifts without splintering. They laid new floors not on the earth, but above it, supported by dry-laid stone piers set in gravel trenches for drainage. Every structure curved slightly inward, creating a self-bracing loop. It was a form of architecture no settler had ever seen, and not everyone liked it. 2 men packed up and left, called it unnatural, said it smelled too much like Indian building. One old woman spat when she saw the living sod roof, muttering that it would bring snakes and poison into the air. But most stayed, most worked, and as the next round of storms swept down from the peaks, wind snarling like a bear clawing at the valley, they watched their rebuilt walls stand still as stone. Nathaniel never rested. He patrolled the town every morning before first light, checking vents, adjusting plug gaps, testing tension beams. He spoke less, slept less, ate only when Caleb forced a plate into his hands. There was something haunted in the way he moved now, like he felt the weight of every structure pressing on his shoulders, as if keeping the valley standing was his personal penance for years of secrecy. Then came the night of the scream. It was late February. The snow had paused. A calm set in, warm enough that the eaves began to drip. People talked of early spring, of planting, of the worst having passed. Nathaniel said nothing. That night, a low moan began near the ridgeline. Not wind, not ice cracking. It rose slowly like a voice rising from under the earth. Caleb heard it first, and sat bolt upright in the sleeping loft of the schoolhouse. Nathaniel was already dressed, staring at the door. "It's here," he said. "What is?" "The real test." The sky opened up minutes later, but it wasn't snow this time. It was rain, sheets of it, heavy and warm, pouring down like the mountain had been holding its breath all winter, and finally exhaled all at once. The ground, frozen solid a few feet down, couldn't absorb it. Water pooled, flowed, raced down slopes, and gathered in yards. The small stream that ran through the east side of town burst its banks in under an hour. People panicked, shouts echoed, lanterns lit windows, children cried. Caleb threw on boots and was out the door by the second hour, wading ankle-deep through water that should have drained harmlessly into the hills. But something was wrong. The drainage systems Nathaniel had taught them worked, should have worked, but there was more water than they'd calculated for. A lake was forming behind the north ridge, dammed by a natural wall of snowpack that the warm rain was now melting rapidly. If it gave way, it would rush straight through the heart of Hollow Creek. Caleb burst into the cabin where Nathaniel was poring over the soil maps he'd scratched on a bark slab days earlier. "There's too much. The old drainage ditches can't handle it." Nathaniel nodded. He already knew. "Then we dig a channel. Cut the mountain before it cuts us." It was madness, but it was the only option. They rallied every man and woman who could hold a shovel, worked by torchlight and rainlight, carving a makeshift trench along the western flank of town, aiming to divert the water before it could reach the cabins. Mud flew, tools snapped, hands bled, but by the fourth hour the trench took form, a meandering gash through frozen topsoil, lined with bark and braced by fallen logs. Then the ridge gave. It wasn't loud, just a dull, wet collapse, and then a hiss like boiling water poured across snow. The lake released. Water surged toward town like a beast set free, but the trench held. The floodwater caught the curve, followed the channel, split into two braids, and skirted the edge of Hollow Creek like a horse spooked by fire. The cabins, low, sod-covered, earth-braced, shuddered but didn't fall. The schoolhouse stood like a root, and when morning broke, the valley was still there. So was Nathaniel. He sat at the edge of the trench, soaked to the bone, mud caked up his arms, watching the water flow past like it had somewhere better to be. Caleb sat beside him. "You knew it might come to this?" Nathaniel nodded. "Why teach us then?" Nathaniel stared into the current. "Because it's not the storm that kills. It's pretending you can hide from it with what's easy." They watched the trench carry the last of the floodwater away, the land breathing in relief. But even as the sun rose, casting gold across the wet earth, Nathaniel's face stayed dark, because somewhere deep in his bones he knew storms weren't the only things that noticed when men started bending the land. The days that followed the floodwaters were filled with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy quiet of people carrying too much weight in their minds to speak it aloud. Hollow Creek had survived. More than that, it had held firm where other towns would have washed away. But victory brought questions, and not all of them were aimed at the storms. Nathaniel Boone remained at the edge of town, refusing praise, turning down offers of cooked meals or trade goods in thanks. He worked, sharpened tools, hauled stone, recut beams others had measured wrong, but he did not celebrate. Something in him had tightened since the flood, as though holding back a storm far worse than any thunderhead the skies could conjure. Caleb noticed the change first. Nathaniel no longer shared sketches, no longer taught new reinforcement techniques, or explained why certain materials behaved better after frost. He had gone quiet again, like he'd done the winter before Caleb arrived, when the mountains had been his only companion. Then one evening, Caleb found him standing alone beneath the new bell tower they'd rigged for the schoolhouse, staring at a crude carving someone had etched into the base. It read, "Boone saved us. The earth taught him how." Nathaniel was not pleased. He turned to Caleb slowly. "They don't understand what that means." "I think they do," Caleb said. "They're grateful." Nathaniel shook his head, eyes dark. "They're turning it into a story, and stories lie." There was something in the old man's voice that Caleb hadn't heard before. Not just caution, but fear. Not of danger, but of memory. That night, in the flicker of firelight, Nathaniel finally spoke of the beginning. Not the beginning of his cabin, the real beginning, the part he'd buried under years of stone, wood, and silence. "I didn't invent any of this," he said, voice low. "Not the joint system, not the sod layering, not the airflow traps. I learned it from a man named Grayson Mott a long time ago, long before I built my first cabin." Caleb leaned forward, watching his mentor with new eyes. "Who was he?" Nathaniel's hands trembled slightly as he unrolled a piece of hide Caleb had never seen before. Older, weathered, symbols burned into it, not drawn, branded. Some were architectural, others looked like they belonged in a language no settler spoke. He wasn't a trapper, not really. Grayson was different, spoke 8 tongues, spent time with mountain tribes, fur companies, even priests out of Santa Fe. Said he'd walked with people who built cities under stone and never saw winter. Caleb blinked. Cities? Under stone? Canyons you walk through, never see the sky, rooms where heat never leaves, and rain never finds a way in. He said the land teaches, but only if you give up thinking you're smarter than it. Nathaniel paused, voice growing quieter. I met him in 22, found his camp in a slot valley near the Tetons. He'd built a structure so strange I thought it was a burial mound, half underground, vented with hollowed branches. The walls didn't touch, hovered between dry packed stone ribs. Warmest place I'd ever been, dry even during thaw, and he let me stay, Caleb whispered. He taught you? Nathaniel nodded. But not all at once, only when I earned it, one lesson at a time. Every mistake was met with silence. He said if I rushed it, the mountain would bury me. I didn't understand then, thought he was just eccentric. What happened to him? Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. Then he said, Grayson disappeared the night before a great storm. We'd spent a week reinforcing the smokehouse he'd built. He told me it would be the last test, that if it stood, I'd be ready to build my own. That night, lightning hit the ridge. Winds tore the trees apart. But his house, his burrow, held. And him? Gone. No sign. His tools, his furs, even his maps, all left behind, like he'd walked into the wind and never looked back. Nathaniel looked up at Caleb, eyes hollow. But he left this, he said, tapping the branded hide, and a warning carved into the lintel of the smokehouse. He drew it in the dirt with a stick. The land remembers. What you build, it will test. What you teach, it will weigh. Caleb stared at the words, heart racing. That's why you kept it hidden, Nathaniel nodded. Because the more you share it, the more the land watches. And if too many learn too fast, the land pushes back. That spring, the land did push back. Not with storm, not with flood, but with something quieter, more insidious. The first sign was the well. One of the main wells in town, dug generations ago, collapsed inward without warning. Not from rot, not from ice. The soil beneath it had shifted, the way it sometimes does when water is diverted too far for too long. The new trenches they'd dug during the flood had channeled runoff deeper into the slope than ever before. It was a subtle, cascading shift in water table, the kind only an old earthman like Nathaniel might have predicted, if he'd been watching for it. Then came the sinkhole. Near the chapel, just a small depression at first. People thought it was a gopher den, until the ground gave way beneath two children playing nearby. They weren't hurt badly, just shaken, but the message was clear. The land had begun to rearrange itself. Nathaniel doubled his patrols, checked every drainage, every vent. He found hairline cracks in structures that hadn't been there days earlier. Not failures, just shifts. A slight buckle in a southern beam here, a sag in the moss trap there. The system still worked, but the ground beneath was beginning to test its footing. Caleb could feel it too, something unspoken in the air, a tension like a bowstring drawn back. The townsfolk noticed, whispered about curses, about the method being too powerful, too unnatural. And then one night someone tried to burn the schoolhouse. The fire didn't take, damp conditions saw to that. But the message was clear, scrawled into the door with a blackened stick. What defies the storm invites the fire. Nathaniel didn't speak of it, didn't ask who, just replaced the door and kept working. But Caleb burned with questions. Why would someone try to destroy the one place that saved them? Nathaniel's answer was simple. Because not everyone wants to be reminded they were wrong. And then came the rider. Late May, a fur-cloaked man on a lathered horse, eyes wild, coat torn. He came from the east, from a smaller settlement tucked between the ridges, one that hadn't heard of Hollow Creek's strange construction methods until recently. They'd tried to mimic it, half-remembered ideas cobbled together from rumor, buried one wall, not all, cut drainage trenches too shallow, reinforced the roof without strengthening the beams below. The whole structure had collapsed during a spring thaw. 3 dead, 1 missing. The rider had come for answers. Did you give them these plans? He asked, voice sharp. Nathaniel shook his head. No. Then who did? Everyone turned to Caleb, because he had shared sketches, in passing, with a trapper passing through, just trying to help, just trying to show the strength of what they'd built. The look in Nathaniel's eyes that day wasn't anger, it was something far heavier. You weren't wrong to share, he said. You were wrong to believe they'd understand the weight. Caleb reeled from it, tried to explain, to apologize. But Nathaniel had already turned away. That night he packed. He left at dawn, said nothing, left only the branded hide, rolled and bound with a strip of bear hide, and a note carved into the hearthstone of the schoolhouse. Build low, build wide, tell no lies to the land. Caleb sat by that hearth for hours. Then he stood, unrolled the hide, and began planning the next structure. This time not just for survival, but to restore the balance Nathaniel had warned them about. Because the land was listening now, and it remembered everything. The storm hadn't come in the form they expected. No lightning, no flood, no sky-splitting wind. Instead, it crept in on boot soles, in whispered blame and wary glances, in the slow, sour shift of trust turning into suspicion. After Nathaniel Boone vanished into the timberline without a word, Hollow Creek was left with his knowledge, his designs, and his warnings. But not the man himself. What remained was the branded hide, the strange diagrams, and a question that settled heavier than snow. What now? Caleb Harker sat at the edge of the schoolhouse hearthstone every evening for a week after Boone left. He lit no fire. He spoke to no one, just sat with the hide spread across his lap, reading the scrawled shorthand like a man trying to decipher a dead tongue. Around him, the town changed. Not rapidly, not visibly, but steadily. At first, they'd look to him, Caleb the apprentice, the last man Boone had trusted. But after the collapse of the Eastern settlement, after the well swallowed itself, after the fire that almost claimed the schoolhouse, people began to ask different questions. They asked why they'd changed anything at all, why they had built their homes like burrows when the old ways had lasted generations, why they'd invited danger by believing in a method no one else dared use. They said it quietly at first, then louder, and eventually they said it to Caleb's face. Maybe it wasn't meant to be taught. Maybe you should have let it die with him. Maybe it was never meant for folks like us. The town split without ceremony, not physically, not into camps or armed factions, but something deeper, more insidious. Half the valley clung to Boone's teachings, doubling down on what had saved them once, reinforcing their homes with layered clay and stone, reshaping drainage paths and rechecking every joint. The other half began to tear it down. One man dismantled his sod roof and replaced it with cedar shingles, said the sod stank in spring and crawled with bugs. Another tore down his earth-packed vent walls and rebuilt them with split pine and tin, said he preferred clean air, even if it came with drafts. Amos Laird, the carpenter who had once railed against Boone's arrival, now stood tall again, preaching the virtues of symmetry, traditional angles, and cabins that looked like they belonged in a valley of proper men. And Caleb, he stood in the middle, hands filthy from hauling earth, head spinning with contradictions. He remembered what Boone had said that first winter. The land will test what you build, and it will weigh what you share. But what if the land wasn't the only one watching? One night, Caleb climbed the western ridge alone. The stars above were clouded, the moon little more than a dull smear behind a curtain of mist. He carried the branded hide under his coat, pressed against his chest like a talisman. By midnight, he reached a small plateau, a place Boone had taken him once, early in that first season. There, carved into the stone, hidden beneath moss and lichen, was a symbol Caleb had never noticed before. It was a spiral inside a triangle, framed by 4 runes, none he recognized, but all too precise to be accidental. He brushed away debris, laid the hide flat, and matched the symbol to a marking in the corner of the scroll. It was a cipher, a key. The runes weren't language, not in the written sense. They were function, a way to align shelter with direction, soil density, wind path. It was as if Boone, or the man who taught him, had encoded not just architecture, but orientation, philosophy in form. Caleb sat there until dawn, eyes wide, brain afire with revelation. This wasn't just a method, it was a map, not of terrain, but of behavior. Every structure Boone had taught, every technique, was a response to pressure. Heat, wind, snow, yes, but also pride, speed, arrogance. The forbidden method wasn't a secret because it was magical. It was secret because it demanded submission, and most men refused to kneel. Caleb returned to Hollow Creek with renewed resolve. The settlement was changing fast. Houses were split into categories now. Old Boone and clean cut. You could tell at a glance. The old Boone homes hugged the earth, their walls curved and irregular, their roofs living, their chimneys wide-mouthed and inward-facing. The clean-cut homes stood taller, straighter, angular with squared-off windows and shingle stacks that gleamed in the sun but leaked in the rain. Arguments flared. Fistfights broke out. A young mother refused to let her children enter the schoolhouse, claiming it was unnatural to learn inside something half-buried. Caleb called a meeting. The entire valley came. He stood at the front of the schoolhouse with Boone's branded hide behind him, pinned against the curved clay wall. Every eye was on him. Every word mattered. "I didn't invent this," he said, "and I didn't understand it, not fully, until last night, but I see it now." He unrolled a new parchment, his own this time, hand-drawn, annotated, a new version of the forbidden method, adapted for the valley, simplified, clarified, honed for people who needed principles, not prophecy. "We thought this was a way to cheat the land," he said, "to beat the weather, but it's not. It's a way to build with it, to admit we're small and fragile, and then create something that bends with that truth instead of pretending we're stronger than we are. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I know some of you hate what these homes look like. I know some of you feel like you gave up something by following these designs. But look around. What's still standing? What's warm? What didn't flood? He let the silence answer. Boone's gone, but the knowledge isn't, and we have a choice now. Keep building with pride or start building with understanding. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Amos Laird stepped forward. His face was drawn, eyes heavy with the weight of too many failures. He looked at Caleb, then at the scroll, and he said, "Teach me how to dig that curve again." That was the beginning of the second Hollow Creek rebuild. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't perfect. But this time, Caleb didn't just lead the work, he taught why. Every beam was discussed, every slope was debated. He wrote everything down. Methods, materials, mistakes. He created a guidebook, not a sacred scroll, but a working ledger. And when trappers passed through, he gave them copies, not the whole method, just what they needed for their terrain, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. One copy went east to a settlement near Red Butte, another south to a Mormon colony rebuilding after a flash flood, a third went to a wagon train out of Independence preparing for their journey west, and Hollow Creek held. That fall, another storm came, a bad one, the kind that cracked trees like rifles and froze riverbanks. To iron. This time the cabins, all of them stood, even the schoolhouse, especially the schoolhouse, and on its hearthstone, beneath Boone's old carving, Caleb scratched one more line. Share only what they'll carry, teach only what they'll kneel to, because the method wasn't forbidden anymore, but it still had rules. The first snow came early that year, heavier than forecasted, blanketing Hollow Creek in thick silence. But for the first time in memory, no one panicked. The smoke that rose from the cabins was steady. The walls did not groan. Doors held their shape. The chimneys breathed slow and warm, exhaling through layered stone lungs into the white sky. It was the sound of survival, not struggle. Caleb Harker stood at the edge of the schoolhouse roof, brushing snow from the vent openings, his gloves stiff from ice, his breath steaming in the cold. Below him, children played in the snowbanks, bundled in layers, their laughter echoing between the cabins like birdsong in a ravine. The homes they ran past, once the subject of argument, skepticism, and ridicule, stood squat and calm, their living sod roofs thick with snow, their walls dry beneath layers of bark, clay, and earth. Hollow Creek had become something few frontier settlements could claim, stable, and still Caleb could not rest. It had been months since Nathaniel Boone vanished. No one had seen him, no trapper, no scout, no messenger. Some believed he had died in the high country, swallowed by the same storms he had taught others to endure. Others claimed he had simply gone deeper, past the valleys and ridge lines men could map, into places where no design, no blueprint, no town square could follow. But Caleb knew better. Boone wasn't hiding from death. He was hiding from legacy, because he understood something few ever did. When you give people tools to shape the world, they start believing they own it. And that belief, more than rain, snow, or fire, was what brought structures down. Still, Caleb hoped. And so, when a letter arrived in the hand of a silent courier dressed in furs stitched from bark and elk hide, sealed with a twist of raw sinew and a chip of burnt cedar, Caleb knew exactly who had sent it. He didn't open it in front of the townsfolk. He climbed the western ridge alone again, the branded hide tucked under one arm, the letter in the other. The air was thinner now, colder. The trees were bare. The mountain was listening. He stopped at the same plateau where he had found the spiral symbol. The snow had mostly blown clear from the wind, revealing the stone beneath. There, where the symbol had once been carved, someone had etched another set of marks. Simple, 3 words. You built well. Caleb opened the letter. Inside was not a message, but a map, drawn in Boone's style. Crude, functional, deliberately imprecise in places, but unmistakably a guide. It led northwest, into territory Caleb had only heard of in rumor, deep snow country. A basin so remote most trappers didn't dare pass through in winter. There was a second item in the envelope, a single iron nail, blackened and flat-headed, with the mark of a cross stamped into the base. Caleb knew what it meant. In Boone's method, iron nails were almost never used, only for anchoring the hearth foundation, the center of warmth and strength in a structure. It was symbolic, a passing of something deeper than a message. It was permission. Caleb returned to the valley the next morning, eyes rimmed with cold but heart burning with clarity. He didn't explain the letter. He didn't name Boone. He simply called a town gathering and placed a new drawing on the table. This one showed not a cabin, not a trench, but a center, a lodge, unlike the others. Rounded walls, a buried hearth, multiple exits, layered rooms built into the slope itself. This, he said, is not just shelter, it's a memory of where this town came from and what we had to learn to survive. They built it in stages. The children helped carry clay. The widows wove bark ropes. Amos Laird shaped the beams with the patience of a man who'd fought pride and lost. And at the center, beneath the layers of stone and soil, they laid the iron nail Boone had sent. When it was done, it stood low and quiet at the edge of Hollow Creek. No sign, no name, but everyone knew what it meant. A place to kneel to the storm and thank it for the lesson. Years passed. The fur trade died out entirely. Wagon trains gave way to railways. Towns turned to cities. But Hollow Creek endured, not because of commerce, not because of politics, because of design, because someone had once said, "Don't build to defy the storm. Build to absorb it." And that truth, the heart of the forbidden method, was passed quietly from one builder to another, never written in official records, never printed in books, just shared between calloused hands and watchful eyes, between those who knew what it meant to lose everything in a single night and those who'd never have to. As for Caleb Harker, his name faded in the way all names eventually do, but his drawings remained, tucked into root cellars, etched into hearthstones, branded into the minds of those who rebuilt. And somewhere, in the deep northwestern basins where snow never melted and firewood snapped like bone, a man named Boone watched the wind shift across the ridges. He built no more cabins, spoke to no more towns, but now and then, when a storm rolled through and passed without harm, he would smile, just barely, because he knew they had finally learned to listen.